And thanks, Reg, for an introduction on continuous improvement and operational excellence. And in fact, on that note, I'm going to build a bit upon what Reg mentioned around the continuous improvement opportunity too around supply chain and why it's really fundamentally important to work with your suppliers and engage with your suppliers to create that change. So, as Darren mentioned, and just to give you a bit of background to CDP, so CDP is the largest global platform for reporting on environmental impact data from companies. Now, that's both publicly listed companies through the investor-led program, so that is driven by the 827 investor signatories that we have that represent $100 trillion of assets under management. So huge influencing power there that they're looking to try and gain as much transparency and exposure into what the companies, the big corporations that they're investing in, what they're doing on the sustainability agenda. As you can see there, we've grown very much over the years and now cover 1/5 of global emissions are now reported through CDP. Now, that's the CDP investor program. What I'm going to concentrate on a bit today is the supply chain program. And you can see there, that's where it sits. So you have the investor authority. Those are those institutional investors requesting this information from the big publicly listed companies. Equally, though, you have the big publicly listed companies and the big corporations requesting the same type of information from their supplier base. And that's probably the part of CDP that is less known about. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. In terms of the supply chain program, you can see some of the numbers up there. We currently have in 2016 89 members with a combined purchasing power of $2.7 trillion. So that's a lot of buying power. There's a lot of leverage, a lot of influence that they can issue onto their supplier base. And as you can see, the benefits are there. In creating this engagement platform for which to really work with their suppliers rather than just demanding information, you can see that over 3,000 collaborative opportunities to reduce emissions were reported in 2015, and 3.5 million metric tons were reported in being cut in a single year. So there's some key impacts there to take away in terms of what supplier engagement can really achieve. So these are our 2016 supply chain members. As you can see, it's a broad sweep of different industries. And what's really important in that is that, and I was taking part in the supply chain and logistics seminar earlier today, and what rang out there was that yes, you should focus on the industry you're in, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn from other industries. So we've had companies come from two ends of the spectrum who you would at first thought not really see any kind of similarities there in how they might do things, but there are common areas to learn from and best practices to share. In terms of the food and drink industry, these are our main supply chain members. Arcos Dorados is the largest Latin American franchise of McDonald's, and then you see the names that I'm sure you're all aware of: Kellogg's, SAB Miller, Walmart, PepsiCo. PepsiCo and Diageo, I believe, are here today, actually. So, in terms of what companies are doing through the supply chain program, but just generally through supplier engagement, I thought I'd give you a few points on what some of these large companies are doing and why it's important. So Unilever, to start with, they actually calculate their Scope 3 emissions, the emissions associated with the purchased goods and services from their supplier base. And what they found is that through this engagement and through just asking the questions, it enabled those suppliers to understand that this was an important agenda to look at and to really focus on. So what they found over a course of years, 21% of their supplier base that they invited to the program achieved a higher performance band in 2015 than that of 2 years ago. And that shows that this is having impact. It is working. by asking the questions, you're making this an important agenda, and the suppliers want to work with you to be able to reduce not only yours but their environmental impact as well. Unilever also uses CDP to evaluate the risk and level of activity that suppliers have in this space, and they use it as a stepping stone to really further engage with the companies. So what we try and do at CDP is we try and take this initial data gathering, information request approach away from the company, so that when it comes out at the end of the disclosure cycle with the outputs, that's the part that's really interesting, and that's the part that the company wants to focus on. So what we try and do is we try and make sure that the information is put in front of them and put on the table in front of them, so they can start engaging further and actually producing actionable results as a result of this kind of first level engagement. Diageo as well. This is another way that they've used to really understand what their supply chain impacts are. So really understanding, because they have a very ambitious 2020 target of reducing 30% reduction in their carbon emissions from their supply chain. And what they're trying to do is trying to understand the level of environmental impact their supply chain has, so they can find out ways in order to reduce that environmental impact. And then on a more practical sense, they've managed to identify collaborative opportunities with the suppliers. Now, you can imagine that a lot of these companies, a lot of these suppliers to these companies, and especially in the food and drink sector, you have a vast supplier base. And sometimes as a supplier, your voice isn't always heard. And this is an easy way to be able to provide that platform for suppliers to be able to propose new, innovative ideas, have that kind of shared value network and that sense of being involved, rather than it just being a compliance method and saying, oh, you've got to fill this out because we want to know this. It's a way for suppliers to really be interactive with their customer more and build that relationship. Walmart, I'm not sure if you've heard, but they had another ambitious goal in 2015. They wanted to eliminate 20 million metric tons from their supply chain. And they actually achieved that. They achieved that through supplier engagement, but how they measured it was through the CDP program, being able to for the suppliers to allocate emissions that were proportionate with what Walmart was buying as purchased goods and services from that supplier base. Coca-Cola takes a more maybe consumer-facing approach, in that their reduction target is the drink in your hand approach, so reducing the carbon footprint of the drink in your hand by a third by 2020. And they again use this program to try and identify how they're going to achieve that, by identifying the opportunities, identifying where certain suppliers might be at different levels and be at different levels, and kind of less advanced and more advanced suppliers in terms of risk and where they want to focus their efforts. And then Kellogg's. Now Kellogg's takes this approach and applies it with a load of other approaches that encapsulate sustainability as a whole. So, the environmental impact is only one side of sustainability. You have the ethical sourcing side and everything. So I know Kellogg's use CDP, they also use SEDEX, an ethical sourcing platform, and combine that with on-farm engagements and surveys to really feed into what they have is a responsible sourcing scorecard, and they use that in annual performance reviews. But they use it as a way to incentivize suppliers, not to order suppliers to do this. So it's really maintaining that collaborative approach that's really important. Metro is quite an interesting example. And this is probably a more practical approach, but what they identified through this gathering of information, and gathering of information can be an arduous task. It's the least fun part of the whole process, but it has to be done in order for you to understand where are the opportunities and where you can work with your suppliers. So as a result, Metro is now collaborating with a food retailer called Real, and Real is the first German retailer marketing food products from permaculture. And permaculture, if you're not aware, and I won't go into the details, but essentially it means permaculture means less CO2 contribution and better water storage. So they've taken sustainable farming practices as a result of identifying the opportunities through the program. They've also done a lot of work around locally sourcing produce. So in France, they have a 100% regional charter with the French Vegetable Producers Association, and what that ensures is that all produce that is sold in their stores comes from locally sourced vegetable farms. And it's a charter, it's a pact, it's an agreement that they've had with suppliers, and they're working with industry associations such as the French Vegetable Producers Association to really drive down the impacts. Because if you can locally source it at the same price, why would you transport the same produce from so many more miles away? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make environmental sense, and it's really putting these actions in place as a result of understanding what your suppliers can do, what the opportunities are. So those are examples. Obviously, why focus on supply chains? These are the kind of 5 main points that I always refer to. Price volatility from resource pressure, business disruption from extreme weather events. I was part of the Logistics and Supply Chain Summit earlier, and it was really interesting to hear from Kayla from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, who came up with a figure of $175 billion were lost over a period of 10 years from extreme weather events related to disruption in business. So this is something that you may think, well, it's not going to affect me, but it will become more apparent if it's not already affecting you, and it's the reason why you need to work with your supply chain. Reputational risk is another one. It's always key. I think the key themes that I saw around risk was reputational risk and risk from extreme weather events, but I think you've really got to separate out the different types of risk. There's risk mitigation, so reacting to the risk when it's at your doorstep, it's about to happen or it has already happened. But then there's also risk prevention, looking more long term, and actually working at CDP. I've heard various presentations from the investor side who are basically saying, this is what we really want to see companies doing. We want to see companies looking at risks in those 2 different aspects. Although companies traditionally look on short-term gains, we want them to look longer term, because it's going to impact whether we invest on them in the future. And as one investment house said, they said, this isn't a kind of issue that we can solve year by year or every 5 years in line with traditional business planning. This is something that we have to look long term. Otherwise, he said, to quote him, he said it's going to be total wipeout. And this is something that we need to look at, preventing the risk before it's already happened. And that has cost benefits as well in the longer term, of course. Obviously, preparing again for that risk is related to levels of increased levels of regulation as well. So you can see that it's a combination of the potentials of loss of profit and the potentials of cost increases. And you can see there that although there are lots of leading companies out there that do engage with their supply chain, do establish these secure relationships, there's a lot that don't. And you can see that grey circle there represents the companies that submit to CDP that say they do not currently engage with their supply chain. So there's a lot of work to be done. But it is possible. And the way I see it is is taking these 3 very high-level, simple stages, but it's a good kind of starting point. So mapping out, what does supply chain risk look to you? Understanding and gaining that transparency within your supply chain. Once you've done that, identifying the risks and prioritizing your areas of focus. And then on the back of that, understanding what you're going to do about it. How you're going to develop a strategy around those risks you've identified. And then, most importantly, what are the gains that you're receiving from doing all this work? So understanding what are the key performance indicators that you're going to measure impact against. And just to give you a bit of an idea of two different examples. So at last year's climate change agreement in Paris, we had a load of our supply chain members commit to public targets, and these are just 2 of them. And the reason I chose these 2 is that they're 2 very different targets, and this is something that CDP enables in 2 different ways. So the top is more around behavior change. So it's engaging with those suppliers to understand where their capabilities are at the moment and where they need to go, and tracking that capability. And again, coming back to, if you're asking the question, it means your suppliers know it's important, it means they know that it's something they need to be looking at, and really furthering that. So tracking that level of continuous improvement, as Reg mentioned in his previous presentation, over time. The second one is more on the quantitative side of things. How are you going to realize impact through this supplier engagement? And as I mentioned, Walmart did by eliminating 20 million metric tons from their global supply chain at the end of 2015. So it is doable, and you need a structured approach, but that is something that there are not just CDP, there are other organizations out there that can help you with. And hopefully this is going to be something that requires that collaborative effort in order for us to get to a kind of sustainable world at the end of the day. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you want to catch me afterwards, please feel free.